and you got a note. And so, as I was saying before my internet interrupted there, welcome to the Canadian Society for Organic Urban Land Care's National Weekly Zoom series called the 2022 Year of the Ecological Garden. If you're not muted, please do go ahead and mute yourselves just so that it doesn't interrupt the speaker. And we do meet every Tuesday it's 3 p.m. Eastern and noon Pacific, and these talks are about 45 minutes, and they include a presentation and generally a Q&A at the end. If you have questions that you would like to post, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. If you'd like to we'll hold your questions to the end and actually ask Gail directly. That's also perfectly welcome. And we do these as to help encourage and promote sort of really regenerative and sustainable and approaches to working with the ecosystem. And we are able to do this and many other things because of the generous and ongoing support of Gaia College. They support SOL in a lot of our efforts. And if you are looking for some educational opportunities, their new semester is starting in September, so they have some great courses that they offer. So for today's talk, it's Gail Fennell giving the presentation, and it's on the, sorry, I just keep having pop-ups. Nature Regina's Native Plant Demonstration Garden. And I'm gonna let Gail take it from here, and you'll just need to unmute, and I'm gonna stop my screen share and you can share your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm just going to get myself set up so that I've got this to play. There we go. Thank you very much. And thank you to Phil Johnson, who's an organic master gardener here, for even suggesting that I apply for our garden to be a greener green space, because I didn't know about the program before that. And since then, I have found out all the wonderful webinars that have been going on besides, and I use the information that they've been providing so far this year. So thank you very much to the Society for Organic Urban Land Care for looking at our application and confirming that we really do have a greener green space. Our volunteers at the garden don't get a lot of formal recognition for all the work they've been doing for 30 years on this garden. So it's wonderful to be able to give them this recognition, and they are absolutely thrilled to be a part of this countrywide across Canada Greener Green Spaces program. So thank you very much for that. I should tell you that everything that I'm talking about is experience-based from either taking care of native plants in Edmonton or here in Regina. I didn't go to school for any of this. I had excellent mentors, and I do research like with the SOL group, who have been putting on lots of webinars. And I pay attention to the plants that I'm taking care of and the insects that are in the garden. So on the screen are some of the things that we had to be doing to qualify to be a green space.
Gail, your screen share is not showing up. Could you just try resharing it?
Okay, I can do that. Let's see, I'm sorry.
That's not a problem.
First, I have to get back on here. So share the screen. Ah, there we go. Here we go. And share. I'm so sorry.
Not a problem.
I'm glad you told me. And now I have to play. Okay. Okay, perfect. One day I will be tech savvy. So now you can see what I'm talking about with the garden. This is the garden. It's not easy to take a photo of the garden. It's 70 feet wide by 40 feet deep. But the thing is, the beings in the garden are like the prairie. If you just drive by on Highway 1, you're not going to have any idea what the prairie is really like. You have to get out of your car and actually stop. And it's the same with the garden. If you just walk by, you're not going to see a lot of the beings, the bees, the butterflies that are in there, because they're so tiny, and a lot of the plants are too. So we welcome people to come in. It's open 24/7. Yes, so growing plants for more than ornamental value and the other things are some of the things we had to do. Plus, we're always looking for plant resources that are unique to the Regina area. So far, we've got about 120 different plant species in the garden. They come and go. They're not always the same ones. There's about 95 insects and spider species that make home there. And 3 mammals, rabbits, voles, and squirrels are the only ones I've seen so far. About 36 different bird species come through the garden for the seeds, or for mostly for the seeds, but sometimes for cover. And we do have bird feeders out in the winter. And there's been an 8-year commitment to being Monarch Way Station. That's mostly through programming with the museum, but still we're the ones taking care of the garden. So we have to make sure that we maintain what they need as well. And last year we actually became part of the David Suzuki Foundation Butterfly Way. So that was a thrill because that's another national program, and there's lots of energy in the city for people to find out more about doing things for the pollinators. And we do some community outreach too. So once upon a time, there was a dream. There was a group with a dream back in 1993. And there was a movement during that time for to use native plants and reduce pesticides and fertilizers. So a group of people in Regina here decided they wanted to do a demonstration garden. And just to prove that you could have beautiful native prairie plants. We didn't have to be bringing things in from other parts of the country to have a beautiful garden here. So the Regina Prairie Garden Project, which was its original name, it took a 5-year commitment from the time that they were doing the planning and growing the seeds in their greenhouses in their backyards to this photo. It was a 5-year commitment. 29 years ago, there was also city seminars on xeriscaping. Xeriscaping is great. It's using less water and choosing plants that need less water, among other things, more plant communities, but it turned into xeroscaping. So a lot of people, when they couldn't use the plants that they had been using, decided they were going to put in hardscaping, like even astroturf, and that still is happening now. So back then, 29 years ago, the Prairie Garden Project people decided or allowed themselves to be interviewed for a full two-page spread, which was really unusual at that time, on using native plants in the garden. There was not a wide variety of plants at that time that you could go and get from the greenhouses. There were a few, but not nearly as many as you can get now. And they explained what they were doing and why it was important to be using the native plants in that newspaper article. So now, 29 years later, we call it the Nature Regina Native Plant Garden. It is a part of the museum programming as well as ours. So, but we're the ones entirely responsible for how the garden is kept and cared for. And there's a new movement in Regina to use native plants and reduce pesticides and fertilizers. So this seems to be a bigger movement. We're definitely taking advantage of it. But this is the preferred aesthetic in most of Wascana Park. The garden is in Wascana Park, right beside the museum. And people still want to see these wide open vistas with a few pretty flowers in different places. I read in the history of the park that this is supposed to represent the prairie. This is somebody's idea of what a prairie is: wide open spaces and a few flowers. Couldn't be much different than what we really have, but that's okay. This is an expectation. So we have this visual standard that we're working against, working with, should we say it that way? So we're trying to reimagine an urban park to benefit all the inhabitants, like the plants and the insects that are there, and creating a safe space to explore the unknown. I'm sorry. So from 5 years of listening to people come through the gardens and talk to me, but also amongst themselves on their impressions of the garden as they're walking through it, our biggest challenge actually is keeping the garden looking tidy and like it's safe to be in. But our challenge is without interfering with the inhabitants, the insects and the plants. And people intuitively understand there's a difference between this garden and the one on the other side of the building. they'd say things like, look how lovely the flowers are, or followed closely by usually, wow, look at all the bees, which triggers an instinctive urban, is this a safe place response. You can hear it in that intake of breath when they realize how many bees are there. Bees aren't caring about them, but they care about the bees. And they want to explore, the people want to explore, at least walk through on the way to or from the museum, but only if they feel safe. So when we first started rejuvenating the garden 5 summers ago, we thought about the best way for people to feel safe is to have well-defined paths and no overhanging plants. So people can easily read that landscape and say, this is a bee and butterfly space, and this is a place where I can safely walk. When people feel safe, they want to explore the garden. When they explore the garden, they become familiar with the insects and the plants there, and they start making connections between the garden and what's in the news about those pollinators and plants. And those connections bring a sense of caring. They either want to grow things themselves, or they want to help the insects at our garden. Now there we go. I found the right button to hit. Safe for humans makes it safe for the garden residents then, because when the humans feel safe, they don't feel any need to doing something about the other insects or what they are afraid of that could be in the garden. So then the garden residents are left alone to build their own communities of helpers, home builders, prey predators, and whoever else they need. And the garden residents' solutions to out of control situations like those aphids in the top left, or making sure there aren't too many bees or flies for floral support like the ambush bug on the top right does, or the ladybugs on the bottom left. Their solutions aren't the same as ours, but they do take time. So the aphids in that top picture were not actually the problem. The aphids were doing their best to help the chokecherry solve a too much water problem, an oversupply of water problem that we didn't even know about. The ladybugs took a generation over the summer to get the aphids under control, in spite of what the ants thought aphids are for. But fixing the broken underground sprinkler system that we didn't use and didn't know about actually solved the chokecherry's oversupply water problem. And by the end of the summer, the chokecherry had its leaves looking pretty normal again and again this year. There was not actually any damage to the tree for that. But do we have the patience to let the insects and the residents solve their own problems? That's one of the questions we have in a very public garden. So when humans decide the questions, decide on how to answer a question, like, are there too many plants or what to do about the aphids? We decided 30 years ago, no chemicals, that's it. We are not going to use chemicals, and we don't even add organic fertilizer at this point. The plants, for the most part, have what they need there. And we decided 3 years ago, in the middle of a drought, no watering except for the transplants, because I couldn't see encouraging plants to be in the garden if we were going to have to water them all the time, if we're heading for an era of high temperatures and less water. And the plants are thriving. They are actually healthier than when we were watering them, because they only grow to the amount of water that they have. They're not waiting for extra water to come along. And this English country garden look that we have is not the right one for the plants we have, because they actually get sick by turns when they get overcrowded. So we're still working on the right combinations of plants to have and how many is appropriate for the space. Finding homes for all those extra plants is not as easy as you might think, especially the ones that like to grow everywhere. But pulling up and throwing away plants to satisfy a human aesthetic is disrespectful of their life, whether they're the wanted plants that grew too well or the unwanted plants that we also call them weeds. And pulling up the plants actually puts carbon back in the air again. So we try to keep it in the ground. So when I'm looking at the garden, I'm asking these questions of who are you going to live with? How are you going to get along with everybody here for a community of plants? And we talk about sustainability. But sustainability is usually talked about in terms of soil, water, and power for the tools. But sustainability of the volunteer resource is the base on which all the other garden plans are built. And 25 years is a long time to count on a steady number of volunteers, it was 25 years when I took over 4 summers ago. So we are so very, very blessed to have had more than 80 people volunteer over 5 summers to restore the garden. We have the, sorry, I just suddenly saw something on my screen that I wasn't sure that you could see. We've had preschoolers with mom and dad to use with Canadian Wildlife Federation's Wild Outside Youth. They come frequently to help us. They're on the top left there. Students, adult work volunteer teams, and retirees and seniors. Some even of the original garden volunteers from back in 1993 have come back to help us out and get us going again. Most come just because they want to know more about pollinators, or they love growing native plants. They want to be outside. Often they don't even have a garden. They just want to be somewhere where there's lots of pretty plants that are helping the bees and the pollinators. We started out with only 14 people. I say only, I was very lucky to have that, and 260 hours. But as you can see, we now put in the equivalent of almost a full-time person. And it's just so very blessed to have all of this community support. Absolutely couldn't do it without all of the people that come to help us out. Now we're going from the beginning of March until the end of November. So here we've got, we're looking at who can be sustainable, who can live the best in the best community. The quackgrass and the thistles in the top left definitely made a community that we just could not allow to keep going, because it's just too much in one place and they will take over. So they got controlled. There was lots of happy bursts of, oh, I thought we lost that years ago, when we discovered ones like the hairy umbrella wort come back. Just they'd been hidden. They were waiting for their day in the sun. Keeping garden in the ground is big with us. So we did take out a lot of quackgrass and thistles, but for the most part, as we're going along now, we are using thick bundles of newspapers and thick mulch to try and keep the carbon in the ground. It helps keep the moisture. The mulch helps encourage mycelium, and there's a lot less redigging if we cover up a space at the same time. But we have to be careful not to cover up all the soil, because bees need their nests, and most of the bees in the garden are ground nesting bees. We decided on hand tools instead of power tools, which means you have to have very strong volunteers for some of the jobs, like digging out the elms. Those are all elms that are only a couple of years old, and yet the roots are up to 4 feet long. So once you get them out, they're out. But if you leave any of the root in at all, then it's just like an dandelion, they come right back. So our choice was to use no power tools at all. But we do, I appreciate how that may change depending on who we have for volunteers. In order to not protect, but make use of the resources we had, where we couldn't leave the plant in place and dig up the quackgrass around it, we put them into pots. We had to actually store them over the winter until we could get them back where we wanted. But it turned out this is a good way to test where in the garden plants like to be. Like our research might like say this place or that place, but now we, like on the bed, that's our brand new bed that we just got at the end of last August, that was all dandelions and turf. So now we use it to test out different spots by putting a plant in a particular spot, and then if it likes it, then it gets planted, and if not, then we move it. It's the patience that we need until the plant can answer that question. Is this a good place for you? The other thing we're doing is increasing the pollinator population density by trying to find those early spring plants, the ones that bloom in March and April before you can even get into the garden, like pale commandra on the left and moss phlox on the right, field chickweed. These all grow in the city. I have found them. Like research is by boots on the ground, walking around the city, looking for the native plants that are growing in boulevards, back alleys, scruffy yards, weedy vacant lots. That tells me the plants are probably going to do well in the garden, and people will be able to grow in their gardens too. So the the other thing I should say about the native plants, the early ones, they stand, like they've got thousands of years of understanding about how to deal with those late spring snowstorms, and they'll almost always recover. It might take them a whole season, but they do. We just need the patience and to think of them as being an injured plant instead of something that's somehow damaged and imperfect. If we think of them as an injured plant that needs time, then it's easier to keep them in the garden and not think of them as something that doesn't belong there. So building soil, that's another thing. We have clay soil here, and you don't want to grow vegetables in it, and you probably don't want to grow most of the ornamental plants in it, but our native plants know how to grow in clay soil. So why would we want to hurry up the passage of time for changing the soil? 28 years or 29 years it took. And this soil went from being flat level with the sidewalk, like the sidewalk on the right-hand photo, to 6 inches of soil. But it took them time. So instead of us adding in extra soil, the plants will do it themselves. We just have to give them time to make their change. And I do have to wonder, why would we want to be doing it faster? Like the native plants know how to grow in soil, so we're taking peat out of boreal forest to amend a clay soil to grow plants that already know how to live here. Not sure that's helpful to the plants. I think that's a habit that we have because of landscaping elsewhere that works for elsewhere, but I'm just saying it may not be the best thing for the plants here. A permeable ground cover will, like the sedges and grasses, will protect against the hard pan for the most part. And if we leave the leaves, then we'll get also another type of permeable ground cover. Nature Regina does outreach, mostly for what we're doing in the garden. One of the things we started with was 1 square meter. When we were talking to people, the idea just overwhelmed of changing a whole yard. I said, don't, just do 1 square meter. In 1 square meter, if you choose the plants well, then you can have anywhere from 10 to 20 different plants, and you'll have enough to make a difference for the bees. And then I showed them the example of one of the Lindley's aster or the giant hyssop, where there's 10 or 12 bees on 1 plant. You don't need to have a huge number of plants to make a difference for the bees and the butterflies. So from the 1 square meter, we started giving away some annual sunflowers that somebody had donated to us. So the first year, last year was the first year, we gave away in upcycled cups. We recycled some Tim Hortons cups and used them for the containers instead of buying pots. But it's a cup of sunshine. In June, our gardens are just starting. Like we've got 3 weeks, we're at 3 weeks into summer, maybe if we're lucky on a good year. So here's a bright little yellow flower that will be blooming, and people love it. They're annual, so you can replace them or keep them if you wish. But that's working well for people just to get started who aren't quite sure how much they want to do. They can still help the pollinators. And we share seeds and advice. Like everything we have in the garden, we generally share it. We have a plant sale once a year, but from the plants in the garden and ones we started from seed. But mostly we believe in sharing the seeds and the plants to everybody who wants to help out. So one thing I keep in mind myself is this quote from The Little Prince. People have forgotten this truth, the fox said, but you mustn't forget it. You become responsible forever for what you've tamed. And our garden is one of the most tamed areas you can possibly imagine. The bees and the butterflies and the other insects are urban. They're as urban as the cities because they have different challenges living inside a city with people walking by all the time than they would if they were out in an actual prairie. So they are urban insects, and living in an urban garden that is taken, it has to be different. It can't be a prairie. We can put the plants there, but it's not a prairie. It's an urban garden. And if we ask the question, what do you need? What do the plants need? What do the insects need? Then we'll come up with the right answers for our very, very tame garden. nothing ever stays the same. 30 years, the garden look different than it does today. And no doubt in 30 years from now, it'll look different. And that'll be the 2050 that everybody talks about, but still it'll be different. So sustaining our commitment to our green space is our gardening challenge right now. We won the award, thank you very much. And we're not going to give that up. We'll make sure that the garden is always a green space as long as we're here. So thank you very much to everybody for joining me and the quick tour around the garden. You can contact me through natureregina@gmail.com or through our website, natureregina.ca. And we do share seeds and plants. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely tour around the garden, and it was also great to sort of see the reality of what you do, what you're working with. And I actually really love that you closed with that comment that they require our care when we have them in these situations, because that's something that I see so often promoted, the idea that native plants are low maintenance. And I'm like, we're setting them up to fail when we tell people that this will be less work than mowing your lawn. Like,
yeah.
They will require our care because we are asking them to grow in conditions that we have altered for our own benefits. But there is also actually a huge value in our participation, which is actually hugely rewarding, because when we give them our care and then we create these habitats, so it just never ceases to amaze me how fast the life comes back.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's
the same summer. The same summer it will be back. You'll see a change, and by the next year, it was only two summers, and I suddenly had a monarch. I'd never seen a monarch anywhere in any of my gardens, and suddenly the second summer here, and there was a monarch.
Yep. Yeah, they find it. It always amazes me how fast they find things. So if anybody has some questions, you can either unmute yourself or put them in the chat, and I'll read them out if you want to put something in the chat. Just think I jotted down some notes as you went, as you were going through. Yeah, actually, one of them was you were showing the examples of sort of that European sort of mode landscape look that I agree, that's a pretty far stretch to call that an example of the prairie. But yeah, just how much that sort of normalized. But those are landscapes that are about sort of standing back and looking out from a distance. And the intricacy when you can come up close and you just see more and more and more life is just so engaging. You mentioned you do plant sale, or you do like the seed giveaway. I was just curious how you manage that, because there's getting to be more and more demonstrations, sort of native plant gardens, and some of them engage in sort of seed giveaways and some don't. And I think some of the new ones haven't quite gotten there yet. So sort of a take on how you handle it as an established garden for the seed distribution. I'm kind of curious about
the seed distribution itself.
Yeah, like how you actually, like, do you pack them and mail them out? Do you just pack some and then have them to give away when people come and ask about them? How do you handle the practicalities of getting the seeds in people's hands?
Well, I'm lucky because it's a 30-year-old garden. We have lots of seeds, like far more than we can have just in here. So generally, it's a request comes to Nature Regina. And then, yes, I have mailed them out to different areas because some of the plants that we have actually can grow in parkland aspen. We're just on the edge of the parkland aspen. We're not just on prairie. So a lot of the plants can grow in both. And yes, I will mail them out to people. Depends on what we have, because the plants don't grow the same number of seeds every year. We have tried seed giveaways, but I don't want to be standing there just doing that, so I tend not to. We tried doing it through the museum. We had to be super careful because any type of plant life coming into the museum becomes an issue for the displays, for the exhibits. Like they can be the tiniest little microorganism, but if it gets in there, then there's a whole exhibit gone. So we don't generally connect that closely with the museum for giving away seeds. I am of the opinion that plants shouldn't be bought and sold any more than people should be bought and sold. It's a little bit political, but if you don't do it with money in mind, and I'm not a business, I'm part of a society, a volunteer society, so I'm not trying to make money at it, but you have a different attitude. Suddenly, when the plants grow or don't grow, there's a different aspect to it. And we will replace any plants, seeds for plants that don't grow. That's not the problem. It's just there's a whole different view of what a plant is. It's something that needs a space to grow rather than I own you and I'm going to put you here. And it's part of how I'm encouraging people to think about their community that they're growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know it's a tricky space. I actually, because like I do a bit of growing and I've started selling so that it sort of offsets some of my time. And I actually really clearly describe that because like every plant, I charge sort of recoup a bit of time cost, and because I would like to see more people be able to actually make a livelihood caring for the ecosystem.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that real thing about, but these are living beings that you have to actually understand. You're adopting a living being, you have responsibility for that. So rather than talking people into adopting plants, I'm often going, are you sure you have the right conditions for this has really particular needs, maybe not this. So I'm more likely to have those conversations, and then I also gather seeds and donate them to somebody who locally actually does the work of distributing them out into the community. Because that's the plants are so generous with their seeds.
They are.
Just I'm like, the plants are ready to sort of restore the ecosystem. All they just need is somebody to carry them and nurture the seeds through the start. And they grow enough every year to just sort of reestablish the whole ecosystem.
They do, and feed the birds and the insects and everybody else. So yes, it's a different aspect. And I do have the fall sale. I was reluctant to start the fall sale, but the response was so great from the people who were looking for something. They want something. And we can take better care of the plants and distribute more plants if we do have the sale. So I am doing that, but especially for volunteers, they take plants home with them. I mean, if we're going to dig the plant up and it needs a home, it can be a volunteer's home too.
Yep. Yeah, and that's actually because I know there's sometimes sort of a sense as people are sort of struggling with the current human footprint on the ecosystem, and the sense of everything we do causes harm. Sometimes, like everything humans, there's that feeling that sometimes people struggle with, and then they feel like, okay, you've got to keep humans away from ecosystems to protect them. And I'm like, no, we can actually be really supportive of ecosystems through our activities. And a big one is the gathering and caring for and moving of seeds. That can really benefit the plants.
Yes, we are part of the community. It's so people who want to take care of a garden one way, and people who want to take care of a garden another way, and all the plants, we're all a community. We all have a voice, and we can learn to work together. Some of us want to do more of one thing than another does, but the people are still part of the community, whether we disagree with them or agree with them. And the insects and the birds, the plants that we want are part of the community just as much as the ones we don't want. Most people don't want a dandelion or foxtail barley, but it's still part of the community. And if the community is a healthy one, then those the plants anyway, and the insects that we are less likely to like, will be controlled by the other beings in the community. We won't have to do as much. I saw that there was a question about when the plant sale is, and it's September the 10th this year. So if you're in the Regina area, you can, we'll be putting the advertising out soon, but yes, we are in Regina and it will be September the 10th, a Saturday. Shine or rain.
Good. Well, rain's good for planting plants, so.
Yes, but not when you're trying to stand in a line.
Yes, I participated in a monarch event here this spring, and it was like warm weather, and the temperature just plunged that particular day. And then it was back up like the day after. And yes, I think it affected the participation.
It does. But what excites me about the sale is having so many people come together who are excited about the idea of creating a space in their garden that they didn't know they could before. And this is actually where I'm going. We're right in the middle of deciding on whether we should be controlling pesticides more closely for residential use. And I'm on the side of, that's why I'm on the side of explaining that everybody's part of our community, and what I do affects my neighbor. And we can't just say this is right and this is wrong. Everybody's got their idea, but nevertheless, there are ways to help the plant community and the insect community and still limit what somebody decides needs to be limited. Like we can do this. And if we invite people into the conversation, instead of saying us and them, then we can come up with a solution. I'm sure we can come up with a solution. One of the participants mentioned about fostering plants, and that is actually Happy Campers and Camp Mom, that we talk about this as we're growing out the plants for the different projects and things like that. So every point of view has a value here, and I really encourage people to be to come and talk about things and not just assume that we're one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can say here in Ontario, they actually banned cosmetic herbicides and pesticides probably 15 years or more now, and it wasn't the end of the world.
No,
we still garden. People still have lawns that are all turf, but it's not as scary as I know sometimes people expect it to be. You know, I live in the middle of the city in a very, very urban neighborhood. It's an old neighborhood that historically was low income, so very small lots. And there's a thriving bumblebee population in my itty bitty urban yard that is multi-generational, and they've been here for years after years. I see the queens, I see the workers, the whole life cycle every year with the garden.
It's absolutely amazing. You know, on the one block, you've got all the different styles of gardening, and yet the bees still know where to go.
I know, they find the gardens. And yes, I know what you mean about that excitement of when people finally find a place to get the native plants. Oh yeah, they're just giddy.
They are. And that excites me to keep on going and do more of what we are doing.
Yes.
We didn't get to go all the way through the video. Is your internet probably stable enough to run it? It's about 5 minutes if people would like to stay, and there's no more questions.
Let me do the screen share again. Where's my screen share?
Did you want me to run mine, or did you want to?
No, that's fine. I just needed to find the right button.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
there we go. What I had done was I went from the beginning of February through to the end of the season. So it's not, it's following a season, but not necessarily all the same year.
Right. I did set them to go through a little bit quickly because there was 160 beautiful photos.
I had it set to go through at 5 minutes.
Okay. For some reason on my system it wasn't auto advancing, so I arbitrarily picked.
Okay. Yep. No, that's good.
Yep. That's it's interesting because of course I'm in Ontario. I'm in Ottawa, Anishinaabe territory, and it's interesting to see the species that are the same and the species that are different, because it's amazing how many of them are the same. And then there's others that I recognize, but I know are considered sort of near native for the Ontario gardeners. Yes, lots of fuzzy little skippers. Oh, what's the silver one?
That's the sage, the Ludoviciana.
Okay.
Ludoviciana.
I actually have that. It just looked, it was a little differently shaped for some reason.
Depends on where it grows. Doesn't look like that everywhere in the city.
Well, and that's the thing, varies in range. Oh yes, and the blue flag irises. You know which rose that is? There's a surprising number of native roses.
This one's the acicularis.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes, the blue flax. Those are so pretty.
Pearl crescent on a black-eyed Susan.
Oh, fleabane.
Philadelphia, yeah.
Yep.
Philadelphia. It's another one that there can be 24 insects on the one plant.
Yeah. Yeah, the Philadelphia fleabane is the one when people get overwhelmed by or are intimidated by the idea of fleabane. I'm like, the Philadelphia one's much more garden scale in the sense of being perennial and not quite as enthusiastic a spreader, I find. Not that I object in my garden to the other ones, but I know sometimes people get worried.
There's a lot of plants you only need 1 or 2. You don't need a half a dozen.
Yes, but the plants sometimes object to there being less than half a dozen.
Oh, yes, there's that.
Yes. Oh, the Gagliardia. People plant those ones here in Ontario, but they're a bit out of the range here.
Mm-hmm.
Although the grasslands have been spreading steadily east over time as the climate shifts. I think they said it's, I forget if it's 60 or 90 kilometers is the actual.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just because of the climate conditions have shifted that far already, and that was a few years ago. So it's probably actually the default range, if we weren't editing the local ecosystems, would have brought it that far just from the climate shift. But on the other hand, the burn cycles have really changed too through our actions. So it's a question of whether it would have come east or not, because there's not as much burning happening anymore.
Yeah.
The
grasslands versus aspen parkland is the issue here.
Yeah.
The Bombus terricola that's in the photos is actually a rare bee here, the yellow-banded bumblebee.
Oh,
and the entomologist at the museum found it 3 summers ago now, and we've had it consistently every summer since. So we're excited to have that one in the garden. That's a bee nest. That's a bee hotel there. That's how tiny, like they might be 1.5 millimeters across compared to the great big bee hotels that get sold.
Yes.
They're just, the bees are too tiny here to deal with those.
Yeah, no, I don't make them specific accommodations. I just leave the plant bits. And they find their own quite consistently. Yeah.
If they have a chance.
Yeah, it's just always amazing just how fast they find their place in the ecosystem. As soon as this place is available, there they are.
There they are. I should mention that you can't really see it from the photos because they're so close up, but there's the asters, in our case, Lindley's aster mostly, sunflowers, which are common talls and annuals and rhombic leaved, and goldenrods are the ones we really emphasize in the garden because those are the keystones. 75% of the pollinators will live on those plants. And then the others tend to be specialists. Plus the birds also benefit from the sunflowers and the goldenrod. Well, not so much the goldenrods, but the sunflowers for sure. So by emphasizing those plants first and then add in the other ones, we're finding that we have a lot of insects. You can, if you want a particular insect, you can say, okay, I am going to grow a low evening primrose, or the pink evening primrose, the butte. It has so many different names anyway. And then you will get that moth. It will come. I don't know where they come from, but they will show up.
I actually got some photos of the evening primrose moth. It's sleeping in evening primrose this summer. And there was 2 of them tucked in one flower, and they're sleeping there. So you can like walk up and take all these photos. It was awesome. And yeah, they're the pink and yellow. The evening primrose here are pink, are the yellow, but the yellow part just was a perfect match. Oh yes, and milkweed fluffs.
So at the end of the summer, we still have got the asters blooming right up until there's a hard frost.
Mhm.
And then, the flax, the onions, the potentilla norvegica, like any of the spring flowers are starting to bloom again from right about now, they're starting. And they will bloom until there's a hard frost. And it doesn't make sense until you think about, it's in the flower's interest to feed as many bees for as long as possible. So if they're spring blooming flower, it makes sense to feed the late bees as well as the early ones from the bee. The bees may not have a chance to make another generation, but the flowers will.
Yeah, well, and yeah, the ones that make sure the whole ecosystem's thriving have an ecosystem to thrive in. And I think that's sometimes something we forget, is that, yeah, it really does come around, and sometimes there's not an immediate obvious benefit, but obviously there was some evolutionary reason. And also that flexibility gives them some adaptability. So if they got frozen off in the spring, well, then maybe they're going to have a long enough season that they'll get a chance to do some fall seed set instead. Yeah, just to sort of keep coming back. Well, yes, the grass seeds against the snow. Yeah, the seed heads. I got some slightly, yes, that was the last one. Slightly fuzzy photos because I didn't. I was photographing them through the window, but I got some lovely photos of little tiny redpolls, so the size of a finch, sitting on or feeding on aster seed heads one winter. They just, this whole batch, and keep, again, birds I don't normally see, but they found the aster seed heads in the city garden, and they just were all over them and cleared all of these, and these little tiny birds feasting on these little tiny seeds. And it's like, yeah, that's a bird feeder.
So I don't collect the seeds anymore in the spring for exactly that reason. I give the migrating birds and the winter birds a chance to have some of the seeds. Yeah,
that's the thing. I'll like go through and I'll grab a few puffs, and then the abundance is there for everyone else. So it's like I make sure this plant was successful by saving a few seeds, and then all the rest can get nibbled on, because they won't get much of a chance to travel too far, considering the limitations in the city.
But that's how humans can be part of the community, instead of feeling like, because I had that feeling of have to step back, can't be part of it. No, I am part of it. And how I think when I'm in that community makes a big difference to the other people in the community, the other beings in the garden.
Exactly. Our actions shape the ecosystem, and how we think about our role shapes our actions. So it's like how we think about it really does change reality for all these other species. All right, well, thank you very much for the garden tour and for the lovely photos. Well, we'll wait for Zoom to process the video, and then I'll get it up onto YouTube and then get it embedded. So I'll send the email off probably tomorrow or later this evening with the link if you want to share it out to anyone as well. And for those of you who are here because you're interested in native plants in urban gardens, there's going to be for next week's, we're going to actually look at quite a small pollinator garden, and a new one for those who are sort of looking for some ideas about how do you get started with a small project. The Windermere United Church Pollinator Garden, which is in Toronto, and they are working with a small space to create community and habitat, and they'll be giving next week's presentation. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Gail. That was an awesome tour, and it was a really good story of the history of the garden, and even how your relationship with ecosystems has evolved with the garden.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody.
Bye.